Very good. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mr. President of the Board, Superintendent Holmes. As Dr. Holmes said, it's strictly an informational meeting and educational meeting tonight. Sue asked if I would just share information with you about reorganization. There's a lot of misconceptions about the word reorganization, and a lot of people immediately kind of quickly jump on just simply the word consolidation, but that's much more than that. But just as Sue said, this is strictly an informational meeting. I'd like to start off with giving my compliments to the participating school districts and also the school administrators and others here. It's always good to collect data, so I really want to say, congratulations and commend you for being proactive in wanting to get the information, gather the data regarding what the options are for reorganization. It's much better to be a proactive status than reactive. So again, we emphasize this is an informational meeting only. Always like to put at the bottom, please understand that no decisions have been made regarding reorganization. This is information only, and hopefully the information tonight will give you a platform or a basis of understanding what reorganization is consisting of. When we talk about reorganization under the current law in the state of Illinois, it's kind of been revised in the last few years, but as far as the options of school districts deciding to choose a different format for delivering education within a structure of communities, there are a variety of options. As I said a while ago, most of the time people, when they start talking about reorganization, the only word that comes into mind is consolidation. But please note on the slide up there that consolidation is just one of 6 different reorganizational options. I've had the pleasure and the opportunity to work with a number of school districts that have decided to take a look and decide whether or not they would want to reorganize in the format of delivering education in a different process. After getting the information and looking at the data, some decided to reorganize, some of them decided not to. But they did what due diligence you should do, is collecting the data. So when we talk about the reorganization options under the current statute, consolidation is on the top here. Conversion, I'll go over that a little later with you. Partial elementary unit formations are happening in some areas around the state. Dissolution, annexation. Dissolution simply means that a school district decides to go out of business. And we've had 2 or 3 of those in the last year or two that have gone out of business, and then they're annexed over to a school district that is coterminous with their particular boundaries. The other one is deactivation. Some school districts will look at their operation and decide that maybe we don't want to continue to operate in the complete status that we have been for a long time, so they deactivate. Rossville, Alvin, up north of Danville, deactivated their high school a few years ago, sent all their high school students to Hoopston and Bismarck-Henning, actually about 10 years ago. So deactivation is where you decided maybe deactivate a part of your district. So and the final one is cooperative high school, that I'll go over with a little later. Those are relatively new and not a lot of them out. The closest one for us down here would be Paris Cooperative High School up in Edgar County. It's a combination of Crestwood School District and Paris School District, and they basically cooperatively own or operate a high school that serves both of those districts. Not too many of those throughout the state. Still kind of a rare occurrence. But I did want to say to you, so you see here that there's multiple options on reorganizations, and that the match for one district may not be a match for another district. That's why you have to collect the data and look and see what would be the best particular option to pursue. Now, looking at these, consolidation is the one we've seen has been around for many years. We've had consolidation in the state of Illinois back in the 20s. The largest consolidation of school district occurred between the mid to late 40s, early 50s, and we went from about 5,000 school districts down to about 1,000 school districts over a period of time, about 20-some years, 25 years. That's when we were taking the small one-room schoolhouses and merging them together in the consolidated district. You can still see some very small districts, and all the districts have in their name Community Consolidated School District. You see that quite often, CUSD. And they usually consisted of probably 4, 5, sometimes 6 small districts. So consolidation has been around for some time. It's the option where 2 school districts or more decide that we need to just merge together and become a single operation and delivering education in a cooperative, collaborative way. It actually creates a brand new district. All of the districts that are involved with that, just typically they go away. They no longer exist, and they become a new district under a new heading, a new banner, a new operation. So consolidation is one that you probably hear a lot about in the state. It's, again, pretty simple and no. It's a little more complex in the fact that the districts that consolidate do give up the identities. A colleague of mine wrote an article a number of years ago about the most difficult animal in the state of Illinois to kill is the mascot. And basically that's very true. The things that we value, the commitment to the legacy of the district, the spirit of the district, the emotional ties to the things that we like to have are also the things that make it very difficult sometimes to give up those things. And his attempt on that article was that it is a very difficult process. So consolidation one. The other one is a school district conversion. You know, in the state of Illinois, we have K districts, we have unit districts, we have the dual districts. A lot of the areas around in your area, my area over in Mount Vernon, the I-57 corridor, and even on up into Chicago, we have a lot of school districts, a lot of K-8 districts that feed into high schools and single high schools, just like you have here. We call those the dual districts. Sometimes school districts have looked at that makeup and decided, you know, the composite, we no longer want the unit district, so we're going to break it up into, convert it to a separate high school district and an elementary. And it's just changing you from what your existing status is to a new status. We refer to that as conversion. Relatively new is what we call the hybrid unit district. For a number of years that there's been efforts on the part of some school districts to want to consolidate. And under the law, it basically says, let's say, for example, you got a high school and you got 3 feeder K-8 districts, and they want to talk about consolidating into a unit district. The law basically says that every district must hold a referendum, and the referendum must be successful in all the districts for that to occur. There have been occasions where 3 of the 4 districts would pass the referendum, but 1 district would not pass, and then it would shut down the whole process, and nothing could happen. It had to be all districts had to pass that. Under Article 11 of a change in the statutes a few years ago, they came up with a hybrid. Now they basically have this, say, if you have a high school district and 3 feeder districts, and they all decide to, by petition, to hold a referendum, and if the high school district and the other 2 feeder pass and 1 elementary doesn't, that does not keep those other 2 from consolidating. They can now consolidate. It now becomes a hybrid district. There'll be a high school serving all 4 of those districts, the other 3 feeder, but 1 would remain a separate elementary, and the other two would become part of it. So it's a little hybrid change. It gave a little more flexibility in the reorganization process. Whereas before, as I said, every unit had to pass the referendum for any of the units to consolidate. But now under the partial elementary unit formation, we refer to as the hybrid. And we've had one of those recently over in Weber Township School District, Blueford Elementary School District, and Farrington Elementary School District. Blueford Elementary passed the referendum, the high school passed the referendum, the Farrington Elementary did not, so they remain as separate, but Blueford and Weber Township now are a unit district, but the high school is still serving the separate elementary. That's a good example of the hybrid process. Now I'm going to go through a lot of this, and at the end I'll stop and see if we have any questions related to any of the reorganization options, okay? And also about the process. When we talk about this Article 11E and looking at the unit formation, partial elementary unit formation, whatever, everything begins with a petition. Nothing, as I said earlier, nothing can happen unless the boards make it happen. Actually, you can't even conduct a feasibility study. You cannot conduct a feasibility study and receive grant money from the state of Illinois unless all of those practicing or participating districts within that study complete a petition or resolution authorizing the study. You can't advance you cannot advance any reorganization options unless all of those participating, all those boards, by resolution pass the petition to ask permission to conduct a referendum. And that permission actually goes through the ROA, through the state superintendent, and back down. So there's a lot of steps that have to go into play before anything occurs. So when we talk about the word petition, it's the main gateway for anything to occurs through board resolution formation of petition. So the public are always made aware. There has to be a local public hearing conducted by the regional superintendent, approved by the state superintendent, and then the referendum. So when we're sitting here tonight just talking about information, that's why we're saying it's an information only, nothing's happening. There are a ton of steps that you have to go through, a lot of processes you have to navigate through before anything occurs as far as changing the reorganization of the district. Okay? Annexation you hear occurring. I mentioned a while ago that under Article 7 of the school code, you can annex. We're finding, or I have found, a couple of school districts that I've worked with, West Richland dissolved through dissolution. They annexed with East Richland. So now we have just only a Richland County school district. Dissolution is, again, where the board decides, for whatever reason, you've collected the data. It might be a fiscal reason. It might be declining enrollment. It might be the fact that you're unable to deliver the programs that you would like to deliver, on and on and on. But for whatever reason, the board makes a conscious decision to pass a resolution to dissolve the district. And when we do that, I always encourage them to do what I call a stipulated annexation. When they dissolve the district, then they stipulate in their petition that they would like to annex with this district, a specific district that they have already had some dialogue with, discussion with about that process. A little district last year called Hoyleton, over in the Nashville area, they decided to dissolve and then annex with Nashville 49 as two K-8 districts, sending their students over to the elementary district. That process requires, again, a majority vote of the board. Prior to that, the board has to announce or publicly announce that there will be a discussion about dissolution. You got to do that 10 days in advance of that board meeting so the public can weigh in on that. In most school districts, and those school districts are communities that are less than 7,500 in population, or school districts less than 750 students, it does not require a referendum for them to dissolve the district and to stipulate an annexation. What happens in those cases, it goes directly to the Regional Board of Trustees under the ROE. And the Regional Board of Trustees will make the final decision relative to that petition that is passed on from the school board requesting the permission to dissolve and to annex. Now that's called an administrative rule. That was a rule that was put into play a few years ago, only for those communities 7,500 population, or excuse me, yeah, 7,500 population or less. It used to be 5,000. Or students, or school district with 750 students or less. Anybody above that, anybody above those particular thresholds have to conduct a referendum asking permission for that to occur. So you can see there's a lot of complexities involved with looking at reorganization. There's a lot of options that you can go through, but everything comes right down to, and I want you to notice that you keep seeing the word petition, petition, petition. A formal document that is established by the boards of education, basically asking permission to do something. Permission to annex, permission to dissolve, permission to consolidate, permission to convert. You know, these are all going to occur after a lot of the data has been collected. Taking a very serious look at the status of the district, your operational status, your performance status, and then as based upon that data you collect, making a decision for a direction, and once you make that direction, you attach that petition seeking permission to travel that pathway. So annexation, again, it's been around for a long time. But most recently, we're seeing it occur under the dissolution situation. We have school districts that are running into real fiscal problems. You guys are very much aware of the fiscal crisis we've been in the state of Illinois. I work with new superintendents around the state, and have around 20 new superintendents that I mentor this year, and 20-some last year, and 20-some the year before. In the last few years, I have school districts calling me, superintendents calling me and say, Dr. Osmond, we're not going to be able to make payroll next month. There's some crisis out there. I mean, and they have no bonding authority left. We have banks that are not as willing to issue lines of credit anymore. So literally, we have some schools that do go out of business and have gone out of business due to those situations. So it's a little different arena that we're in these days as far as previously. Okay, when we talked about the options, the new options I mentioned to you in this slide, all this slide does is just tell you that they were trying to look at different ways to give school districts more options in regard to reorganize. For years and years we had nothing. Basically we had consolidation. I mean, you either consolidate or you didn't. You could annexation, you annex, but not as smooth as you can now. But the Article 11E is the one I mentioned earlier that gives us a lot more permission. This slide you can see a little bit. For example, this is kind of under that 11E. When we begin to look at a high school district, Z is the encloses all of that, serves all of those. But this is what I said. If District B does not vote it in, then they remain a separate district, but they're all served by the high school, but these become part of the unit. And that's how the hybrid would look under that particular setup. Again, a little larger piece, you can look at that too. Elementary districts B and D, can consolidate under Article 11E. This was an interesting new approach. Used to, you had to be coterminous. You had to have boundaries that matched up perfectly with each other before you could consolidate. Now, with the new Article 11E, Elementary District B, who's not coterminous with Elementary District D, can now now actually petitioned to consolidate under Article 11E. I have not seen one of those yet, but that's a little more complicated, but it is on the books. Again, that optional elementary unit, we talked about the hybrid district, the one I mentioned with Weber Township. We had Bluefer Elementary, we had Farrington, and then we had the high school district. We only had 2 of those. So the high school became serving all 3, but again, Farrington, due to the fact that they did not pass the referendum, remained in elementary. That's the hybrid type approach, okay? Deactivation, that is happening again. I do get a call every now and then that says we'd like to deactivate our high school. We can't afford to operate the programs, or we don't feel like we're capable of providing the quality of classes or college preparation courses or advanced credit courses. So as I mentioned, I used the example of Rossville Alvin, and they made that tough decision a number of years ago, about 10 years ago now, 06, yes. And as I said, they basically pay tuition to Bismarck Henning and to Hoopston, and they basically tuition their students that live within their district to those 2 high schools. Parents actually get a choice. They can either go to Bismarck Henning or they can go to Hoopston, but the high school actually pays the tuition. It's actually a negotiated fee with those 2 high schools as far as what the cost would be per student. So they go out of the high school business, but they do not lose the responsibility of educating the high school students. They still have to educate them, but they educate them through a tuition cost basis for their education. So we call that the deactivation. And you know, I don't run across too many that have deactivated their elementary. The only ones I've ever dealt with have been the ones that have deactivated their high school. Again, because of the inability to provide the program, the changing aspect of the program, the cost of the programs, and so forth. Okay? The cooperative high school I mentioned a while ago, the one up in Paris. It's a the state funded them for a brand new high school. It's a beautiful high school, but it's actually under the cooperative high school. It's jointly operated by 2 school districts. Again, Paris Unified School District and also Crestwood School District. They continue to have their own boards of education, but representatives from Crestwood and representatives from Paris now sit on a cooperative board and operate the high school that serves those districts. A little different situation. They are now looking at an additional district north of them. Shiloh is looking at joining that cooperative high school program. Okay? So again, I talk about the requirements. How does this happen? Board resolution, petition. This does require a referendum. The voters have to weigh in and approve these set up, and then the establishment of that cooperative agreement, and then creating that governing board I just spoke to. Okay? That's called the cooperative high school. Well, what's happening in the state of Illinois? I haven't picked up my last year data, but going back 2014, 2015, the number of school districts in Illinois, you can see them up there, we're a total of 853. We're down a couple now. You can see the distribution, total number of K-8 elementary, only 369, 70. Secondary, around the 100 figure, units 386. I always throw the Department of Corrections in there. For one, total 853 district. The number of reorganizations occurred during that year. We had 2 consolidations, 1 annexation, which was the West Richland, East Richland annexation of West Richland into East Richland. We had 0 conversions. We had the 2 hybrid formation, one being Blueford, one being up in Kane County. No deactivations at that time, but we had 5 reorganizations. So I show this slide to show you that this is not something that is occurring in large scales. And each of those districts that are represented up here in the reorganization spent a lot of time studying and looking at. These are decisions that you really want to weigh in and have a lot of the data, because you're making decisions that impact the lives of students, parents, community, and anybody else connected to them. So we don't see a lot of them occurring. Now, these are the actual ones that occur. Now, there have been a number of studies. If I list the number of studies that have been conducted, the numbers would be 3 or 4 times that. But what that says to you, they'll do the study and they collect the data, and after they look at the data, they begin to say, well, maybe that's not the right decision. Maybe we need to just stay where we are. Or they look at the data and they say, based upon the data, it looks as if we would be wiser in moving forward and adopting some other type of reorganization pattern and attempting to make that happen, okay? Again, some of those ones, I forgot about the Spring Gardens, one of mine over there in the Jefferson County, Spring Garden consolidation. That was when Spring Garden became the new 178, that was a consolidation of Dodds, Ina. And then Salt Fork, Catlin, and Jamaica consolidated a year ago. And then the hybrid formation I mentioned earlier about Bluford in Jefferson County, and then the Woodlawn Unit District was a hybrid formation also. And then the annexation I mentioned of the Little Holton District, number 29 with 49 elementary in Nashville. All right. Feasibility study, I've mentioned that word a couple times. The state really encourages school districts that are talking about reorganization is to do your study, collect your data. Make sure that you are looking at all aspects of the operation of schools and that would impact students, staff, parents, community. And so they have set up a process where you can receive grants to run feasibility study. I don't even think I did send you that information about just recently they have they've funded the grant studies once again. So they do have money out there for grants. The way the feasibility study comes as a result of dialogue about boards wanting to explore what might be some other options. And following through, what I'm saying is make sure you do your due diligence, make sure you collect the data, make sure you look at all aspects of that. And so when the school districts are at that point, then the boards of education can, through a resolution and a petition, request through the grant money, request for grant assistance to conduct feasibility studies, okay? So it goes from the Board of Education. Again, this is another one of those things, nothing happens unless the boards of education take the initiative. And so the boards of education of those school districts that want to look at what reorganization's impact might have, then they would, basically agree to conduct the study. They send their request to the regional superintendent of schools. The regional superintendent of schools will review their application, their request, to make sure that it meets the letter of the law. Then the regional superintendent will submit it to the Support Services Division of ISB. They'll review it. They'll decide whether or not it is approvable or denied. If they approve it, it comes back to the ROE. They notify the school districts and say, you have been approved for a grant in this amount of money to conduct a feasibility study. So with that funding, that does basically set up a way where the state is trying to assist school districts in their studies to collect the data to be better informed in making decisions that are as serious as reorganization, okay? Once the agreement is approved, the ROE signs agreement, gets back to the School Business Services Division, and then you go out and find the districts that are working together will find someone to conduct the feasibility study. You reach an agreement with that particular party, and that agreement is sent in for approval through the ROE and also through ISBE. ISBE reviews the grant, the agreement form, and then they would either approve or deny it also. Okay. Some of the things that we look at, or the state requires that you look at, there's 10 items. 10 items. Number one, they look at transportation, because many times when school districts are consolidated, there can be a large geographical area, and transportation can become an issue. So they begin to look at the transportation in detail. They look at the cost of transportation. They look at the cost per mile. They look at the time on the bus. They look at all these issues through the study and come up with a conclusion and make recommendation as to how consolidation might impact the overall transportation operation of the newly merged districts as compared to the present impact operating as separate districts. Is it going to cost more? Is it going to create longer periods of time on the bus? Or is it going to be extremely efficient, costing less, and a more streamlined time frame as far as students on the bus? So part of the study will basically break out into that part of the transportation. Another issue that we look at is looking at the area of finance. Obviously, because you're merging districts together, you're merging fiscal operations, and just like one of them up here, and I'll get into this financial incentive part a little later, but I want to look at if the formation of these new districts, what impact does it have on the finances? In the state of Illinois, we have a couple different ways we get revenue. We get revenue from the state aid, and the state aid is governed by attendance and also your particular local wealth status. And that all comes into play in what we call the state aid formula. So obviously when you begin to pull 2 districts, 3 districts together, it changes the whole perspective and the data that factors into those formulas. So we have to look at this. We project ahead. We look at what the total enrollment might be in regard to those districts that are consolidated. We look at the local wealth, the EAV, and see how that might be changed, because the combination of shifts of those can also shift your state aid. You can have school districts that consolidate together, and they may end up getting more state aid than they got separately as separate units. They may consolidate together, and due to the numbers, they may end up getting less state aid than they were getting as separate districts. And that's where the incentive piece comes into play. In that situation, if, for example, 2, 3 districts consolidate and they end up as a result of the combination of the local wealth and the ADA cause them to lose some state aid, the state will pay the difference in that loss for a period of time. Not forever, but it will give it to you over a period of time, and it's all calculated through a formula, and that's all part of the study that you would be participating in. So we've got transportation we look at finances. Also, the finance part is that the study includes doing a 5-year projection. A 5-year projection on this new reorganized unit. What does the revenue expenditures look like going forward 5 years? Now, those are really guesses. If you're part of the state right now, we still got some, my superintendents right now are trying to figure out how much revenue they're going to get. Are they going to get 2 payments in categoricals, or are they going to get any payments in categoricals? It's a little tougher right now to basically try to project, but part of the study will be to kind of look at it through what we call a cohort survival index factor, looking at the previous trends and trending forward through 5 years. The other thing we look at is enrollment trends. We look at the enrollment. We actually look at the previous enrollment. What's happening in enrollment? Are you declining enrollment? Is enrollment growing? What will happen as far as enrollment going forward if you merge these districts together? and we begin to look at the impact on that. So enrollment is another one of those portions of the feasibility study that has to be conducted. Staffing, obviously, is a huge part of the study. You know, we look at in school business, we talk about FTEs, full-time equivalents. And full-time equivalents is simply how many staff members do we need for the number of students that we have. You know, if you like a class size of 20 students and you've got 100, you like a class size of 20 students and you've got 100 kids, you need five staff members. I mean, simple, that's just simple math. So we basically look at that and see just what are going to be the staffing requirements, regular staffing requirements, support staffing requirements, all the other specialty areas, and begin to look at those costs too. You also have to examine the multiple contracts, the various contracts, the union contracts, because especially under consolidation, if you consolidation, there has to be a total renegotiation of the contract to form a new contract. So we basically look at the contract. Under the present status, we in school districts consolidate. The law presently says that the highest salary schedule has to be the one that's adopted. Now that tends to create a strong interest on the part of some people. When West Richland was being annexed into East Richland, when we looked at the study, I noticed that there's 3 or 4 teachers that were really excited about that possibility. The one teacher there, a young man, or not, young man, younger than I am, basically experienced like a $22,000 raise just in that situation. That also is attractive to the people in those schedules, but at the same time, it can be a fiscal burden in the whole distribution. Under that status, the state also provides incentives for the salary differences. If there's a salary difference for the total cost of salaries as separate districts versus the total cost of salaries for the combined districts, if there is a burden there, then they will pay those differences over a period of time. If they're calculated, most of the time it's 3 to 4 years. I always tell the district, they get excited because sometimes they get incentive money of $2 or $3 million because of the reorganization. I tell them, don't get too excited because 4 years from now that's going to disappear. So you better be doing your planning and your due diligence right now in making that happen. But it is good to have that incentive to help you go through and to make that transition from existence as separate districts to become a organized overall new formation. Yes, ma'am.
Will you talk at all about the determination of what staff is selected?
I will. I can tell you right now, under the present law, all continuous service staff have to be accommodated, or we say tenured staff. Basically, that is part of the law right now that says that the teachers that are under continuous service or tenured have to be accommodated. They will not lose their job. Those that are non-tenured, those that are from the initial, that's still under initial certification, can be at jeopardy in the reorganization. Classified staff are presently at-will employees anyway, but they could be too based upon efficiency. Here's what I always say to the districts. Let's try to make sure that this doesn't harm anyone.
What about administration?
Administration, same way. That's one of the negotiations. I'm going to talk about the committee of 10 in a few minutes who makes those decisions as far as what buildings to use, who are going to be the administrators, and also we talk about the restructuring of the boards of education. All of those things come into play. All right, so I've talked to you about the options of reorganization. I've talked to you about the study piece and the components of that. The additional components under the study is also, in addition to staffing for classroom, the extracurricular staffing, the extracurricular programs, the sports, the fine arts, and all of those things. Those are sometimes where the positive aspects come into play, where you're able to offer some programs. The reason that Rossville Alvin did, they deactivated their high school, they couldn't really offer advanced placement. They didn't have like 2 or 3 students in an advanced placement, so they weren't able to do that. And that was part of the reason for them to do it. But when we look at the program as far as the study itself, we also look at curriculum. We look at the offerings. What are you presently offering? What are the school districts presently offering? Each individual units, what are you presently offering? What would that combination look like under a newly formed unit? We look at those situations, and the extracurriculars we talked about. So all of those critical components are part of that feasibility study. Feasibility studies, again, those that are funded through the state, requires us to look at all 10 of those items, requires whoever does the study to make a recommendation to whether or not they would recommend that the reorganization should go forward based upon the data. Sometimes that the recommendation is not to. Some people get the misconception that every time a study is done, the recommendation is to move toward that reorganizational option. That's not the case. Lawrenceville, a couple of years ago, and Red Hill, we're looking at that whole process. When we conducted the study, my recommendation to them was not to consolidate. Not to consolidate. It was not going to be fiscally efficient for them to do it. Transportation was going to be a nightmare. And so today they continue to remain separate. The reason I make that is you have to look at each situation given its particular platform, footprint, and the data that's revealed to you. You really have to use that to make your decision based on that. Okay? So I mentioned the general state aid difference as a financial incentive, the salary difference, again, as a financial incentive. If there's a deficit fund balance, if school districts, for example, have gone into debt for facilities or whatever the case might be, they will pay the difference in the deficit fund balance. The other thing on that part is that any debt that had been created by a district, any original debt, District A had original debt, that debt stays with that district, even though they're part of the organization. The taxpayer still will have to be responsible until that debt is retired. So it doesn't get spread through all the others. Now, have there been cases where in the reorganization that they reached an agreement that they did indeed spread it? Yes. And you can do that. But the state says, basically, the bottom line, whatever debt was created by whatever district remains with that district until it's satisfied. Okay? That comes up quite often. Certified staff, this doesn't even require any calculations other than the fact that the state will throw in $4,000 for every certified staff, the total number of certified staff members that become part of that newly organized district. So it's just 4,000 times whatever the number of certified staff, and typically that tends to pay out over a 4-year period. Now, you notice down the bottom there, I have kind of a leftover statement, and I'm not sure what it is now. State of Illinois is not only the land of Lincoln, it's the land of proration. We have proration on everything, state aid being one that we've really been dealing with, but also under the incentives a few years ago, they did a proration on those at 76%. I'm not sure where that is at this point in time. Okay? But knowing that prorations seem to be prominent, there's probably some proration on these particular formulas. All right, what are the steps to reorganization? I mentioned the word petition. And that happens with the Board of Education. Unless those 7 members of the board, a majority of those, if they don't reach an agreement, nothing happens. Even if they reach an agreement to move forward through a petition, there has to be public hearings. The local public gets a chance to weigh in on these things. You have to have approval through the regional superintendent, the state superintendent. Unless, notice I put in there a while ago, I talked about the administrative rule. Administrative rules, 7,500 population, 750 students. Then you went straight to the Regional Board of Trustees. But in most cases, you have to deal with a referendum, and this is another opportunity where the public weighs in and makes a decision whether or not anything happens. And so the referendum approval is, again, not required under that administrative rule, but that's only under that particular piece. This is another interesting fact. Who may petition? Obviously, the boards of education are the ones that have the local governing authority, and they typically are the ones that do advance a petition. But under the statute, petitions can also come from the public. Actually, the West Richland dissolution and annexation was a public-generated petition. It was I think as long as it's, I think the figure is 20% of the registered voters from the last election can actually advance a petition requesting some type of reorganization, in most cases dissolution. And it can go through the Regional Board of Trustees. I typically never recommend that because I think this should be a board action situation. It's only occurred, and the reason it occurred over there is that the board had ran it once and the opposition shut it down because you can, through oppositional petitions, can interfere with that Regional Board of Trustees action. So the board was fed up and they decided we're not going to try it anymore, but a group of the citizens in the community decided we are going to, and they're the ones that were successful. I only bring it up to let you know that there is that, it's 10% of the voters residing in each district. So that petition again follows through, petition from the board to the regional superintendent to the state superintendent for approval. Again, the proposal, all of those things. Now once you go through that, and if you are indeed beginning to look at consolidation, if you're looking at any type of reorganization, it requires you to create what we call a committee of 10. And you're at the bottom. Committee of 10 basically are individuals that are selected that guide, they basically guide that reorganization into existence. You were asking those questions earlier about placement of staff, placement of curriculum, selection of administrators. And normally the committee of 10 is usually a distribution from all those boards or even staff or even community from those participating districts or the districts that are part of the composite. And so these 10 individuals normally get put into the petition, not always, but normally get put into the petition. We like to get them in there. And so that we know that these are the individuals that are going to work to make sure that this happens. That it's not going to be just left to anybody else's religion to come out. It's going to be guided by some individuals, okay? So, committee of 10, here's the thing, they develop the curriculum. They basically not only develop the curriculum, they set the tax levy. They basically decide the staffing. They determine the use of facilities, which is usually a big one. Decide where the students are going to be. The committee of 10, and they also kind of guide, they get organized even prior to the referendum. They even guide the referendum into existence. Example being, if at Brownstown, St. Elmo, they were really debating on the overall placement of students and use of facilities. And it actually, their decision killed the referendum. Instead of making it less cumbersome on transportation, they made it more cumbersome on transportation. But somebody wanted an attendance center, elementary attendance center in St. Elmo, and wanted to have they actually wanted a kindergarten, grade 1, K3 attendance center in St. Elmo, intermediate center. The recommendation of most of the people would leave the K5 elementaries in both towns. And but anyway, they decided to go that way. And so they had people that lived part of Brownstown that all the way almost lived to Ramsey, and the transportation was going to put kindergarten kids on a bus for almost 45 minutes or so. It killed the referendum. So you really have to look at, or they have to look at, all the critical components. The review of the expenditures, and then, as I said, they talk about making wise use of the state incentive. If a petition does not result in, let's say the districts advance a petition, nothing happens, it's voted down. Nothing can occur again for 2 years. It's a cooling off period. Unless there's a substantially different change in your petition. For example, one of the districts, there were 4 districts that were looking at a consolidation. It did not pass. The referendum failed. The one district pulled out, so they filed a new petition that only had 3 districts. That was a substantial change, so the state allowed that to advance, and it did pass, and they were approved. So petitions do have a time frame. The public hearing, I think all you need to know here, you've got a lot of information out there, is there has to be public hearings. You have to conduct public hearings either through the regional superintendent. If it's the regional board of trustees, there is a very detailed process that they have to follow with notices, timeframes, hearings, publications, and so forth. So a lot of public hearings are included in any type of action dealing with reorganization. The state superintendent has those 21 days, as I said, when we file a petition, we've got 21 days for it to come back. Again, the referendum approval is the majority of the reorganizations require a referendum approval. Kind of the steps to look through is this little chart, flow chart basically. Number 1, it begins with identifying the need. Collect the data. You got to know where you are. You collect the data to find out where you are. Where are we right now? Where do we exist? 4 separate districts. Where are we? Start collecting the data to find out where you are. How do you feel about it? Well, what's our disposition toward our existence as separate districts? Is there a better way that we can deliver educational programs? That's all part of that need. You collect that data, and whatever your situation is that you decide, a local public hearing, board petition, goes to regional superintendent approval again, state superintendent approval, back to you to say go ahead with a referendum. And again, not always, but that's typically the process that you go through to make any type of the reorganization pieces to happen. I always like to sum up these presentations. It's a huge consideration. It's a serious consideration. And I say up there, please focus on the data, and collect the right data. And make sure you're looking at the right data. But make sure you communicate what your intent is. What are your goals? What are you all about? And what is best for the students? Now people say, well, what about the community and what about the parents? Well, they're all too, but I tell you the bottom line when you're deciding here is what's best for the students. And typically what's good for the students is usually good for the community, good for the parents, okay? So please ask yourself the following question, a simple question, is it good for kids? I think that has to be laced within all of the decision and discussion that goes on anytime that you're talking about making any change in your school. I'm talking about even if you're changing your own operation within your own school. If you're moving from separate primary to non-graded primary. If you're changing your cafeteria schedule. The bottom line, is it good for kids? That's what we're all about. If it's not what we're all about, I say pack up your tents and let's go home. Because that's what it's all about, okay? And you're looking at those situations. That's why you have to be careful about collecting the data. I do watch people at times make decisions that turn out not to be good for kids. And you've got to be careful about it. It's almost criminal sometimes, some of the things that we do that cause problems for kids. Think it through very wisely, collect your data, and make sure you're marching in the direction you want to go. So again, I just want to say compliments to school superintendents and the school boards, because the whole thing is about being proactive. A lot of data thrown at you tonight. I think you have a handout there. I think everybody got a handout with a different type of reorganization studies. Let me also say you can go online to ISBE and go under school services, and there's additional information on all of these options out there for you to look at. Educate yourself, inform yourself, collect your data, ask your questions, And just make sure as you move forward, whatever the case might be, make sure the decisions are informed decisions, and again, that they're good for kids. Again, I have to end up reminding this is informational meeting only. No decisions have been made. I haven't talked to any of the board members. I met the board members tonight. I was asked to come to and just share information about reorganization. And we're not at a point here. Right now, it's a point of basically say, what's reorganization all about? Is there any possibilities that we can look at for the future? And that's my purpose of being here. That's a quick presentation. I would consider some questions, I guess, if we have time, right?
Sure.
Questions? Yes, ma'am.
What happens, or have you ever experienced the committee of 10 being split on decisions as far as?
It's just like any other committee, majority rules, and they're,
I know, but if it's 5 and 5, if there's 10 members.
Yep.
Have you guys ever seen that anywhere?
I have seen that, and they just tend to basically work it out. Yeah, there's, anytime you're dealing with, there's going to be some controversial issues. I think the thing, and that's why when you're selecting those people in the committee of 10, you want to select the individuals that have a vested interest, who are going to take a really quality look at all the data and are going to be open-minded, but also at the same time, they're going to be able to look and do what's best for the overall school district.
Your outstanding debts that the district is responsible for, how does that get paid? If your tax base gets consolidated?
Well, what happens is, for example, if you've got an outstanding debt, you've got basically in your tax rate for the district, there's a portion of that is basically committed to whatever the debt might be. Let's say it's 12 cents, 15 cents, okay? So if the levy is set up for the new district, let's say it's $3.80. Those people that had that debt, if it was 12 cents, their tax rate will be $3.92. So that additional, whatever that commitment to that debt will remain with that particular group of taxpayers until that particular debt is satisfied.
And you have to do a referendum on that, or is that all in the big process?
It's all been part of the process.
Historically, how many districts in the state of Illinois attempt this annually?
Not a whole lot. Not a whole lot. A lot of them, as far as attempted. And a lot of them will do the studies. There have been a lot of studies. Probably overall, as far as the number of studies, probably less, right at around maybe 25% of the studies, 30% of the studies actually end up going into actual reorganization. A lot of studies are conducted. But the actual finale of it, like I say, I saw 5 or 6 there, probably previously 5 or 6. And we may see some, on a good year, we might have upwards of 10. That would be a rare period of time. Most of the time, it's usually around 5. There have been some years when we haven't had any. I mean, we still have 860 school districts, which is interesting. I live part-time in Kentucky, and I work some with some down there, and they're on a county-wide system. They don't have that many. You go to Indiana, I think, what do we have over Indiana, like 102 districts or something like that. We're still one of the rare states in the country that have as many districts as we do. And so that's still why consolidation or reorganization is still of some interest. But it is a difficult thing to pursue, and it should be, because it is a very serious thing when you start restructuring how you deliver the education for the students.
One other question, sorry.
Go ahead.
I can't remember the exact year, but it seems like it's been 7 or 8 years ago. Sheila Simon went around the state.
Oh, they did a consolidation task force.
Right, and I was a part of the group, and some of the people in the room, I think, were part of the group that met at John A. Logan Community College. And as I recall, there were about maybe 30 to 40 people representing schools and so forth at the meeting. And the conclusion of that, of course, that was a different time. The budget was, I don't know, probably not as bad as it is now. But,
No, any prior years, it was not. I mean, it just gets worse every year.
But there seemed to be, like in that room anyway, at least people that came to the meeting, not a lot of people were interested in fighting.
Oh, no. No, there seems to be a little more interest now. A couple reasons that started the interest. The recent discussion about a statewide tax cap that's still out there causes some districts some concern. Some of the fiscal capabilities that have been somewhat restricted, like I mentioned earlier, line of credits are not as easy to occur. Some of these things are causing people to start looking at other ways of existence. Not on a large scale, but it is beginning. As a result of the last one, we did that task force on reorganization. The end result was encouraging school districts to find ways to cooperate with each other, which we have been doing a lot more of that. But that was prior to our fiscal crisis hitting at the level that it is right now. And when we have this potential statewide tax cap coupled with a potential of the redirecting of pension liabilities to the school boards or local school district, there's a combination of perfect storms brewing that's beginning to cause some school districts say, hey, I better take a look at something here because we're coming down. This is the first time I've ever had one of my superintendents down in DeSoto. Been working with a little local bank for many years. Tax anticipation warrants never been a problem. They issue them. Line of credit's never been a problem. They issue them. Line of credit's basically you borrow money to get through. It's just like borrowing to get by. And I call it the golden triangle. You borrow the money, you get a line of credit, you pass a bond referendum, you get the results, and you pay it off. Now school districts are running out of bond authority. Their bond limits are being depleted, but now we're finding school districts that are not being able to get the line of credit. He was turned down. He had to go to Carbondale, which is not a long way. He had to go to the bigger banks to get line of credit because some of the banks are hurting. And our credit rating in the state of Illinois, our bond rating, has continued to dive. And when that happens, school districts used to be a good bet. They used to not go out of business. I've been in this business a long time, and just the last year I've been working with school districts that are actually going out of business or calling me up and saying, we can't make payroll. Or actually one the other day called, tell me about these teacher orders. You know, on the books in the state right now we have on the books that you can issue promissory notes for salary. We used to call it back in the mining industry, they used to call it script. They called it funny money. But you basically went out and you find a grocery store that's willing to take your promissory note, or you find a service station, and basically what teacher orders are still in the book. And basically the banks you take your promissory note, and the bank would convert it to cash with the promise that the school district would then in turn pay them. That's still on the books. That's the first time I've ever had it. I had to look it up again when somebody called me about it. Now we're not there yet, but I'm still trying to hope that we get over this hump fiscally because there's some districts hurting, and that's caused them to start wanting to look at some of this. But no, you're right. There's just like, they don't like to. We don't like change. Nobody likes change. I don't like change, but it does create a difficulty when you have to start losing certain identities. I have some small schools, small communities that no longer have a post office, they no longer have a grocery store. And the school is the only vestige of any identity that's left there, and they lose that, they kind of lose their identity. I understand that, I seek that. But at the same time, I have to help them look at the fact, but what are you doing for kids? I mean, you've got to keep focusing on what's best for kids. And that puts it in a tough situation. I do get a little put out some of the districts when they get hung up on mascots and colors, and that's the only reason they don't make changes. We had one that had the mascot was the eagle and one was the bomber. One of my colleagues, I guess he'd heard a little bit of that too much, that was hanging up the discussion. He said, I've got a solution to that. You got the eagles, you got the bombers. You just call them instead of the bombers and the eagles, you just call them the beagles. It didn't go over real well. But anyway, there's a lot of emotions tied into it. There's a lot of issues that you need to look at carefully that affect kids, that affect parents, that affect staff members, teachers. That's why I'm saying to you tonight, I commend you for wanting to begin with collecting data and information but I also challenge you and charge you to continue to collect and inform yourself, educate yourself, and the bottom line is there a better way for us to deliver education in our regional area? If so, what might it be, and how might we go about causing something to happen?
My last question, I promise.
No problem.
So, going forward, is it the responsibility of each of our 4 individual boards to initiate that feasibility study, to pass it through the board, and then do
No.
all 4 have to pass it before a study can be?
Before a study can be funded through the grant, correct. Do some school districts fund their own studies? Yes. There have some school districts that don't even bother with the state grant. They basically will just contract and do a feasibility. They'll pay for it themselves. But most of them do go through, and in that situation, all participating districts have to petition for that grant.
Is there about $11,000 for the study? Is that about?
It varies based upon it varies based upon the total enrollment of the composite group that's studying. It runs somewhere around a low of 5,500 up to 10,500, 11,000 or something like that. And then what you do, you take that amount and you basically find a contractor out there that's willing to do these studies, and then you negotiate a contract with those, and then that part of the money can be utilized to pay off that contract.
So the group of 10 does not have to be identified for the
Right. Feasibility study?
the feasibility study. That would come because people are going to.
Committee of 10 is when you get to the point where you want to advance your petition,
That's to go to a
I
private.
recommend that you have 10 people identified to help make sure that guide that process all the way through.
So if 2 or more of the districts came out of this and decided to pursue a feasibility study, whether they applied for a grant or self-funded, does that contractor come in and do all of that data mining with the local, or with each of the individual district administration and staff, or how does that process work?
That's a big part of it, because a lot of the data that has to be collected to basically to determine some of those projections I mentioned comes from the districts. For example, you would come in and you would actually look for the last 5-year budgets. We examine the last 5-year budgets. We look at your enrollment data. We look at your staff. So that's information. There's a lot of information that has to be collected locally at each site. But then again, there's the demographic data that's done through the Illinois Department of Data that, for example, we
The
get.
contracted group will
do that.
Do all that data. So what kind of an administrative burden or cost is it during that 3-6 month process of the study?
Mainly to interface with the consultants, to answer questions, and to provide requested data. The other thing too that, and I always recommend, and I want to say, anytime you engage in this process, transparency is extremely important. Keeping everybody in the loop is extremely important. I always recommend that you periodically, not every month, but sometime through the process of the study, conduct public meetings and share information on the way.
That's a great segue. That was my next question. Is there a process for community input, or is it more of kind of sharing along the way that's typical?
Well, typically the input comes normally when the community sharing meetings and informational report out meetings, and people will ask questions, which is very good. Sometimes they're very pointed, sometimes they can get a little bit of bristly, but at the same time, it's important to do that. And I've been in meetings where they've come up with some nice recommendations. And the committee of 10 is back there collecting the data as those come along. Very good questions. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the length of time that
Oh, yeah.
the study actually takes?
Sure. Well, if you're doing a study through the state of Illinois, they require you to have it completed by June 30th of whatever time you start. Normally, the study begins sometime around this time, November, and sometimes January. It's usually about 4 or 5 month process. Mainly because these are not full-time. Most of these consultants are not full-time focused on this, so they're basically doing this along with everything else they're doing. So they kind of work out a schedule and typically try to get the final all the data collected. The actual study, the report, sometimes can be 200 or 300 pages in length, and with a lot of different charts. And the final piece is sometime around May, is the consultants are required to make a presentation to the school boards, and it's usually a collective meeting of the boards. And in that presentation, they also are required to make a recommendation. What they see is the best direction to take in regard to reorganization. That's usually typically where that ends. You receive the study, the regional superintendent of schools receives the study, and the study also is filed in Springfield with the state superintendent of schools.
So,
But even there, it's just a study. You know, at that point, it's just a study. And there's been many studies that boards have looked at, and nothing ever happened because it's their decision. They are going to make their decisions. They should be informed by the data that's collected and composited and summarized in those particular reports. So about 5-6 months.
so in terms of a realistic timeline for this year, you had shared, and I think the state superintendent's bulletin a couple of weeks ago identified that there was money available for application for this process. But we're going to be moving into November board meetings. That would be the soonest, I would think, that our boards could even consider a resolution to pursue the grant, which it sounds like there would be some time for that to be processed at the regional office and at the state level, which would probably almost put us too late for a study for this year.
Yeah, there have been studies that have been started like in February, completed by June 30th, but you're really squeezing it up toward the deadline. Because you're looking at probably doing presentations to the board the 1st of June or so. And as long as you get it within the June 30th. But the comfort level is like, I get school districts call me and want me to do referendum planning for them. And I say, well, when do you plan on going to referendum? Next month. I said, well, I'm sorry, because I usually like to do a year. I like to have a year in advance because there's a lot of education that goes into play. And so in this case, comfort level most of the time, and most of the consultants that do these like to have at least 5 or 6 months, good solid months to make it happen. Now they usually have a team or so that comes in, so they usually 2 or 3 of them working together collectively. And there's a number of them throughout, not a number, there's 4 or 5 teams throughout the state that do these things.
And does that require bidding for the districts to bid out for that service?
No. Does not require that.
From the time that it
It's less than the bid requirement.
would make that decision, if there were 3 or 4 districts that said, yeah, we're interested in conducting the study to gather data, once those resolutions are passed, what would be a realistic turnaround time from having the resolutions to actually beginning the study?
That's a good question. It depends on how many is being processed as the state for approval. Michelle Henniger is the lady that kind of conducts that at ISBE. I don't know. I don't know what the turnaround will be. ISBE is really having some tough time. They're only about maybe 40% of the staff that they used to have 10 years ago. And it's really tough. So I don't know. I couldn't answer that.
But if the districts chose to pursue it without worrying about the grant, you could start as soon
state's
as
cut out.
you bid it out, or as soon as you
Yeah.
contract.
Yeah. Your question was how long you'd have to wait for grant approval. Yeah. No, if you don't do grant approval, it's just a matter of the board making the authority to do that.
But with the sheer number, few numbers that they have going through the past several years, there's not a whole lot of applications.
Well, there's more applications for feasibility studies.
Yeah.
And I don't know what those would be, but they just announced the funding for that the other day. And as we answered the questions a while ago, there are some conditions now that are causing more interest, but I don't know what that is at this point. It's hard for me to gauge at this point. I could easily get a call in tomorrow and let you know, Sue, what seems to be the turnaround. But you're right. I mean, it's whether you go, the grant approval is going to be a little more time frame. versus just doing it.
So 2 quick finance questions, and I think that's it for me. One, you answered a portion of it earlier, which was if some of the districts that would potentially pursue a reorganization have existing debt, that stays within that existing
Right.
kind of geographical or taxpayer base.
That original
about-
district.
About like tort liabilities and things like that.
Tort liability will all be totally redone in the levy, that the levy will be changed. Tort liability and risk management plan, now you would have to be creating a new risk management plan because you got different individuals that are gonna be showcased in those particular plans. And when I talk about the Committee of 10 working on the tax levy, I mean, right now I'm working with school districts on levy, and tort's a big thing right now, but that would all be restructured under this new district. Because there wouldn't really be any residual reason, only thing, you know, even if you had outstanding lawsuits, for example, out there, the distribution still would be, because remember, you're gonna be building a higher EAV to multiply whatever your tax tort rate's gonna be times that, so there's gonna be the equivalent amount of money still gonna roll in on that.
But that becomes, if there are existing awards out there, then that new combined will absorb that across that new EA.
That's right. That's right, because right now, the only stipulation in the law about any prior commitments is under the debt, existing debt.
And that would all be evaluated under
Right.
kind of this. Okay, so that was one finance question. The other is, with a lot of talk at the state level of changing the funding formula, how would you deal with that funding formula changing kind of while you're in the study? Do you look at options of what kind of the leading kind of draft legislation is showing, or what working groups are showing,
Yeah.
or how do you?
Well, right now, we've got one new option going called evidence-based funding that really would actually be a benefit to, especially our districts down in this area where we are very much involved with higher risk. We don't have as much wealth. And so there will be additional money under the evidence-based funding model for those districts in our particular area. But yeah, I don't know, you'd have to look at it at the time. And typically when you do the study, we just basically look at the existing state aid formula, the local wealth factors, we look at the double whammies, whether or not your ADA is impacting, and your EAV declining, increasing as a reevaluations. All of those go into play too. Yeah, it's that's why each study is such an individual, portrait of what's going on. But we do have some interesting things that are emerging right now that also throw into, like I mentioned earlier, with potential statewide tax freeze and then the cost shift on the pension. But all of us are going to suffer that. All the districts are going to suffer through that if it happens. Other questions? Well, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to come by. I wanted to say again, it's my pleasure. The attempt here tonight was to mainly get you started, whet your appetite. You're going to have a lot of questions. Ask the questions, do your homework, do your research. But the bottom line is make sure you do the due diligence, collect the data, and move forward carefully, because this is a very critical, very serious decision. And bottom line is, the question I always say, is it good for kids? That's what it should always be about. Thank you a lot. Appreciate it.